Chapter 2. Jaden was standing on the edge of his brother's command tent. It was just past sunset, but it was far from dark. The funeral pyres lit the fields brighter than the day had been, the low-hanging clouds, which had deadened the sunlight, now providing an almost solid wall to reflect the firelight. It gave the scene an eerie, dreamlike appearance. Even from here, Jaden could hear the men muttering about it being an unnatural night. Jaden actually preferred it. Had it been a clear night, the fires of the burning dead not so bright, the Sarah would have been celebrating, drinking and brawling, and frankly that had always seemed disrespectful to Jaden. But hells, Jaden was just happy that Harold had finally called him off disposal duty. He had done his best to diminish the blow to what remained of his honor, keeping his involvement to command only, not involving himself in the actual physical work of moving bodies. But all day he felt the eyes on him, heard the snickers, mutters, and rude comments. It had been degrading, and Jaden knew it was his fault. If he'd kept his damn mouth shut... Jaden shook his head, turning his focus back on what was happening inside the tent. Harold was holding court, surrounded by his officers. For over an hour, Harold had been listening to the reports. Most of the information Harold would have already heard. This was as much about filling in his command staff as it was about gathering his information, and even if it was just a title, technically Jaden was a member of the command staff. He needed to hear. They had done exceptionally well. Other than Duncan's party, only one of whom had come back from the swamp where the Tamarin had ambushed them, they had lost less than 36 warriors, 4 of whom looked to have been mauled by a bear. At least another dozen were injured enough to take them out of the next few battles. That brought their numbers down to less than 250. Assuming nothing went horribly wrong, they could push through at least another battle this size before they would need to stop for reinforcements. There were a total of 3 Austeran armies, but the third never left the Austeran capital, and the second was nowhere near as well armed or trained. They could conceivably take all the land King Owen had demanded without even calling for reinforcements, which would be a huge feather in Harold's hat. So why was Harold looking so grim? They had lost almost 4 dozen horses, but would be able to easily make those numbers up by using Austeran animals. Jaden had already grabbed one for himself before the best could be claimed. They had also been able to salvage enough rations from the Austeran army to feed them an extra 2 or 3 weeks, beyond the month their own rations would last. A couple of tents had been trampled, and 3 of the camp followers had been killed, but overall it was possibly the best outcome that they could have hoped for. The latest general finished his report and stepped back away from the map table. Harold was silent for a moment, staring at the map before he cleared his throat. "My father has requested my presence back at court. A messenger from the Austeran king arrived in Dana to negotiate peace. General Harris will take command of this campaign until I return. I want you to push through Dakar now and take the city. We usually attack from the sea, and I think we can surprise them by using the tall grass to circle around and come at the city from the west. It's an important port, and I don't want Austera to have access to it. The first guard won't be there to defend the city, so you should be able to take it relatively easily. I will make sure to send on a governor and a troop for the occupation as soon as I am back in Sarah," which would give Harris less than 2 weeks to take the largest western city in Austera. It wasn't asking a miracle, but it was asking a lot. The general nodded sharply as Harold continued. "I will be riding out tomorrow at first light, and you will have the army ready to push east by noon. Prepare horses for Lord William and Sergeant Ecrian. We will take the prisoners off your hands as well." He glanced around the tent, silently checking in with the various generals, captains, and lords, before nodding sharply. "That will be all. Harris, Jaden, stay for a moment." Jaden stood still and silent as the important men bowed to Harold, ducked brief nods to General Harris, and walked by him without a sideways glance. Years ago, he had taken insult at just such a breach of etiquette. Harold's boon companion, William of Dana, had pointedly refused to bow to Jaden. His face burning with shame, Jaden had called insult on him. Of course, insult had led to a challenge, which Jaden had lost spectacularly. His ribs still ached a little in winter. For years afterwards, every time anyone left a room with him in it, they had looked him dead in the eye and walked by with straight backs. But Jaden had learned his lesson. He had never called insult again. Eventually the nobles had grown bored with their games, and while they still didn't bow to the second prince, they no longer made it quite so bald of an insult. Jaden stayed by the door even as Harris stepped closer to Harold. He knew well enough that whatever private conversation Harold wanted with his general was not meant to include his younger brother. He had been asked to stay for some other reason, probably for Harold to give him some other demeaning task. Jaden could just barely hear his brother running through a list of more precise commands, and it made him feel like he was spying. He turned away, staring back out over the battlefield. Barely a few steps away, the prisoners were chained, bound together and bound to a post driven hard into the ground. There were not many of them. Sarah warriors were rarely worried about taking prisoners. It would be dishonorable to kill a man that was begging mercy or surrendering, but no one would purposefully try to save an enemy's life in battle. Jaden flinched, trying not to look at the tall man at the end of the line. No one would try to save an enemy's life, unless they were attractive, it seemed. No wonder his brother thought him an idiot. The tall young man was leaning back against another prisoner's back, his eyes closed, but Jaden could tell he was awake. He'd probably just had a mother of all headaches. He was leaning against the same girl Harold had taken down. While Jaden watched, she gave a little shrug, jostling the tall boy just enough to draw his attention, and spoke, quietly. Jaden was close enough to listen. Hells, there were dozens of Sarah close enough to hear them, but she spoke as if it were a private conversation. Of course she did. She was speaking Tamarin, a language barely ever heard outside of the small region of Ostera the Tamarin called home. I can't believe you let yourself get beaten by that whelp. The tall man shrugged, the ghost of a grin pulling at his lips. And what about you? Jaden couldn't see her expression, but he could hear her tone, which was amused, if annoyed. Don't forget I was trying to save your ass, she snorted. And it took the big one to take me down. The man laughed, his hand going up to shield his eyes, but did not respond. After a moment, the girl nudged him again. You going to tell me what happened, Kai? He started to speak, his grin freezing in place, before he shook his head. And a hand dropped on Jaden's shoulder, pulling his attention back into the tent and towards his brother. Harold was looking over his shoulder at the prisoners. Without removing his hand from the younger prince's shoulder, he snorted. They look cozy. She the one that almost killed you after you took him down, right? Are you upset to find he has a bitch? Jaden snorted. It would not actually affect either of their lives if he had 6 wives and 4 women on the side. But he shrugged. Really, Harold? Look at them. They're like 2 versions of the same statue. She's his sister. Harold looked again, and Jaden took the moment to watch them. The true prisoners had noticed their audience and had turned to watch the princes. They both shared the same black eyes and long faces, and the same features that gave the boy an undeniable masculinity made the girl objectively beautiful. They both had long, straight black hair, though only the boy had shaved the sides. They were probably not much older than Jaden himself, but faced with the future monarch of the most powerful empire this side of the world, their sharp eyes held almost identical expressions of only mild interest. Harold snorted. I guess they might be related. Jaden shook his head. They look more alike than we do. It was true. Though Jaden and Harold had both taken after their father, they looked almost nothing alike. Harold had inherited King Owen's broad build, his height and strong jaw, and Jaden had inherited his long limbs, his dark hair, and his dark brown eyes. Most of the court said that Harold looked exactly like King Owen at 27, and Jaden looked more like Owen at 15, which was just great. Jaden was only 22 years old, after all. Harold looked his younger brother up and down, taking in his slim build, his narrow, beardless face, his long, delicate hands, and finally shrugged. True. Come sit. He nodded towards the chairs around the map table and took a seat himself without looking back to see if Jaden would follow. And there was another difference in the two of them. Harold was a natural leader, assuming obedience from any and everyone. Jaden, on the other hand, had never even been able to get his childhood companions to follow him into pretend battle, back when he had had companions. You did well today, Jay. You fought well enough and showed no sign of cowardice. Jaden's heart soared as for once his brother met his eyes, but kept his expression guarded. He knew there would be another side to this string of compliments. Harold looked away, and Jaden sighed. Here it came. I was planning on having you continue with the campaign, Harris would be more than capable of keeping watch on you. He cleared his throat before Jaden could consider challenging the notion that he would need someone to guard him. But Father's instructions were for you to come home as well, though I can't imagine why you would be needed. And there it was. Rather than continuing with the army and retrieving some honor by comporting himself acceptably on the battlefield, Jaden was going home. He snorted. He couldn't even bring himself to be anything more than mildly annoyed. He did not particularly like battle, and was not cold-hearted enough to see it as a tool to make a name for himself. Harold continued. I wanted to talk to you, though, because Lord William will be riding with us. You are to offer him no untoward behavior. Jaden closed his eyes, biting down on a surge of anger. It had been 7 years ago, for God's sakes. Jaden had been a kid, and Lord William of Dana had been a handsome, friendly older boy, a good friend of the brother who was already beginning to treat Jaden like a coward and a weakling. Jaden had developed a crush. He knew it was wrong. William wasn't one of the eligible young ladies of court that Harold was always throwing at him, but Jaden was young, and he couldn't imagine the kind of trouble that would come of it. He had honestly thought William liked him in return when the boy started spending more time with him, even sometimes without Harold around. One day the older boy had stayed late after weapons training, ostensibly to help Jaden clean the swords. William had leaned over him, probably to pick up the leather armor on the ground, and Jaden had kissed him. Maybe William had been trying to make friends with Jaden. Even a younger prince could one day have power in court. Maybe he had seen a lonely boy and wanted to make him feel better. Maybe he had been setting Jaden up. But no matter what his original intentions, William had pushed the young prince away and slugged him. If it had ended there, Jaden would have been embarrassed, angry, maybe a little ashamed, but it hadn't. William had run off and immediately told Harold and all the young lords that followed the crown prince. Harold made no attempt to hide his anger and disgust from, well, anyone. Combined with Jaden's comparative lack of fighting skills, his delicate build and features, and his complete lack of interest in normal boyish pursuits, even those who had no way of knowing the details soon knew the younger prince to be a craven degenerate. Jaden clenched his teeth. I would never, Harold snorted, a cold sound. It's a little late for never, Jaden. Just keep your hands to yourself. He stormed out of the tent, leaving Jaden alone with his dark thoughts. If he ever raised a hand to William again, it sure as hells would not be in desire. Jaden glanced up, suddenly remembering this was a tent. The canvas walls gave little more than the illusion of privacy. Through the walls, outlined against the campfires, Jaden could see shadows, men close enough to have heard every word, and right in front of him was the tall man and his sister, watching. Great. Now even the fucking prisoners knew what he was.